You guys seem to enjoy the previous installment of this series, so here are 5 more chess life hacks. This episode will be focused on the knight, since I believe it is the trickiest piece in the game. Number 1. A king and a knight form one of the most solid structures in the game. Shout out to Antimatter2417 for this one. I've always known this idea existed, but I never really paid too much attention to it. After analyzing it a bit, however, I can say I am definitely going to be looking out for this now. And the reason this construct is extremely solid is because the knight covers, very conveniently, most of the dangerous squares for the king. So let's look at this position a bit. A king and a knight in the center position in this way, look at how many squares this structure covers. It gets to cover all of these squares. And even though the squares in front of the knight are not capturable and defended, it still stops any checks from rooks or queens in that direction. Keep in mind, this is this structure at its weakest. A queen can still annoy the king by check spamming if there are no other pieces around. Where this hack really becomes strong is when the king gets closer to the edge of the board. Now you can see it becomes even more difficult to check the king since half of the dangerous squares no longer exist. And of course, it becomes even more difficult as the king walks towards the corner. This is very specific to the knight, since usually a king in a corner with a piece blocking it is very susceptible to getting checkmated or get into a very uncomfortable position. But if you look at the squares covered by the knight, it actually stops the queen from checking in the most dangerous way, and it becomes very difficult for the queen to actually get close to the king where she can deal the most damage. I also want to add that this check spam by the queen is very easily ignored by white here. If you look at it, the king can never be separated from the knight adjacently. The only way to stop the king from staying adjacent to the knight would be to check it on e3 or c3, but if you look at these squares more precisely, they are the squares defended by the knight, which makes it very difficult for black here. And for white, well, since the rook is defended by the knight, this is just a very easy fortress. Number 2. Knights alternate colors on each move. If you highlight all the available moves for the knight, you can see they are all different from their current color. From this, you can also conclude that they can also only attack squares of their current color. This is, in my opinion, the biggest and most easily exploitable weakness of the knight. First of all, since the bishops are different colors, they can never ever be forked, which is yet another reason I will always prefer the bishop pair in the endgame. It also means that whatever pieces you have that you don't want to get forked, you can simply place them on different squares and the entire trickiness behind the knight is completely gone. But perhaps the easiest way to exploit it is to target the defensive ability of the knight. In my opinion, the knight is by far the worst defender in the game. Every other piece can continue defending a certain square after moving. The bishop can simply stay on the same diagonal, and the rook on the same file or rank, and of course the queen can do either of those. Even the king kind of sucks at defending, but in its own kingly way, even he can continue defending the same square. And even the pawn can do that in certain very specific and unlikely to happen scenarios. But the knight is the biggest coward there is, abandoning literally every square it was defending after every move. It kind of reminds me of OnlyFangs dipping on Tyler 1.
Big heels on me! Big heels on me! You can't listen! Finish it! Don't run! Finish it!
To prove my point, let's look at this position. So, in this position, white is clearly winning, but this pawn is passed and is kind of annoying. So what is the easiest way to capture this pawn? Well, we see that if we just simply attack it, black has no real way to defend it with the dark square bishop because it is on a light square. And this is a far more competent defender than the knight. So now black doesn't have a choice but to defend it with the knight. But let's see what happens when he does. So let's say he defends it with the knight, but now we can simply attack the knight because this knight can now no longer move and defend this pawn, which means that we are guaranteed to win this endgame and win this pawn very, very easily with no hassle because the knight simply sucks at defending. Number 3. In my previous episode of this series, I mentioned how a king 2 squares away diagonally from a knight is the sweet spot for annoying your opponent, since the knight requires 3 moves to attack this king. At Varmi pointed out a very nice way to get into this position very consistently. When getting checked by a knight, moving in any diagonal will guarantee the knight cannot check you on their next move because all the diagonals are on the color that's opposite to the knight. It is not only this diagonal that guarantees you not getting checked, but also this one and this one. And of course, if you choose to go here, you make an illegal move and lose the game. So, for example, in this position, let's say black checks me with his knight. That's kind of annoying and I don't like it. I could go directly adjacent to it, but since I can actually choose any diagonal of my choice, I'm actually going to pick f3 because it is closer to my pawns. So let me go here, and now let's say black moves his knight again. Now I am primed up to create this very quote-unquote juicy position by being 2 squares diagonally away from the knight, and I am now also closer to my pawns, and this is a kind of drawn endgame, but I think I would prefer white here most of the time. Number 4. The knight is the most easily dominated piece in the game. This is kind of turning into a knight roasting video, but not only is it the worst defender in the game, it is also the biggest bottom ever. Jesus Christ, what is this script? A dominated piece is a piece that cannot move but isn't attacked. It's basically a trapped piece that cannot be captured yet. This basically only ever happens to the knight, since the other pieces have very long ranges and would only ever get dominated if they could also be captured, meaning they'd be trapped. You've probably heard the phrase, a knight on the rim is dim. On the edge of the board, suddenly the knight has 4 of their available moves taken away. And since they always alternate in color, it means that their remaining 4 squares are all the same color. It would really be a shame if there was a way to cover all of these squares with one piece. It really is fitting that the bishop can dominate the knight in the endgame, really cementing it as the better of the two. And you've guessed it, the closer it gets to the corner, the easier it is to dominate or trap. Again, a single bishop is enough to put the knight out of commission, but if you have a queen, literally all of these squares trap the knight. Next time your opponent willingly puts his knight on the edge or corner, try to look for these very freaky tactics. Number 5. Okay, this is barely a hack, but the knight versus pawn endgame is one of my personal favorites, since it has a lot of life hack-esque patterns in it. I will attempt to teach it to you in a few minutes. Let's start with the easiest version of this endgame. If your knight can get in front of the pawn, that's going to be the easiest draw you will ever get. Because once it is in front of the pawn, the black king has no way to kick out the knight from defending the d1 promotion square. See what happens if he attacks it. You simply move the other way. And it doesn't matter which way he attacks you from, you will always have a square to continue defending the d1 square. But that's the obvious stuff. What if you cannot get in front of the pawn, which was probably going to be most of the time? Well, in those cases, your only way to win is to get lateral control. Let's see what happens when you don't get lateral control. Let's say you play knight e3. This is a big mistake, because now the king can both attack your knight and the d1 square, which means you just simply lose the game here. The key is to get lateral control, and now you can see the evaluation bar is 0. Let's look at each of black's options. One of their options is to simply move away. If they ignore your knight, then you don't have to do anything with the knight because you are controlling the d1 promotion square. What becomes tricky is what happens when black tries to attack your knight. Let's start with king e1. This is the easiest one because now you simply just get the knight to the other side. Since knight d3 comes with a check, now black, doesn't matter what they play, you simply go to the other side. And now the pattern repeats. But what if, instead of playing king e1, they play the trickier king e2? Now suddenly you don't have knight to d3, and it also is not a check. In this position, you have to know the one way to win is to fork the king and the promoted pawn. The only way to do that is once the pawn queens, the only square that forks them is c3, which means in this position, the only winning move is knight e4. Now black is kind of out of options because if he moves his king, this square very conveniently also attacks the d2 pawn. So that is not an option. They must move their pawn. And, well, if they promote to a queen, this is the easiest fork, and we can simply claim our draw. Some of you might have noticed that if black plays king e1 here, we need a lot of space to maneuver our knight to the other side of the board. And, well, that's not always the case. What if it is a knight pawn? Well, in those scenarios, even if you do get lateral control, you have no way of getting to the other side of the board. So if black chooses to play king c1 here and you maneuver your knight to b3, they simply have to play king c2, and now you have no squares available to prevent the b1's pawn's promotion. The only way to draw in those endgames is the first method, where the knight can get on in front of the pawn and cover these squares, and this is the only way to draw if it is a knight pawn on the 7th rank. I know what some of you are saying. Even if you can get in front of the pawn, you still need a little bit of space to maneuver your knight. What if even that space is denied to you? What if it is a rook pawn? There are two different scenarios for the rook pawns, and let's start with what if it is on the 6th rank, not the 7th rank. Very distinct difference. The 6th rank, you might have heard of the idea of the circuit. This is basically a life hack. You simply need to draw 4 squares, the first one being the one in front of the pawn, and then simply complete the circuit using 3 knight moves. If your knight can defend the pawn from pushing by going to b4 here, you have entered the circuit and have claimed a draw for white. While you are in the circuit, you can always either capture the pawn, stop it from pushing, block its path, or fork the king and the pawn. In other words, you always have a play that stops your opponent, and knowing that you do is enough for you to find it in your games. Now for the trickier of the two. If the pawn is on the 7th rank, the white knight is being attacked by the king here, and it therefore needs to move since the king is very far from protecting it, and it also needs to stop pawn to a1 promoting. Basically, it has a lot of reasons it wants to move, but to stop the a1 promotion, it has 2 different squares it can choose from. It can choose knight c2 or knight b3. Which of the 2 should you choose? The way to choose the correct square is to understand that whichever square you choose, you're going to be creating a barrier for the enemy black king. So let's start with knight c2, the incorrect move. Let's look at the barrier that this knight creates for the king. So to see what the barrier is, we first need to highlight 2 moves that the knight defends. So right now it's defending e3 and d4. It also is defending e1, but we will see that this doesn't really matter. But if you're kind of perceptive, you will know that the whole idea behind these endgames is to fork the king and the pawn. And which squares can the king go to get forked by the knight? It's d3 and d5. We can see that if it goes to d3, we simply draw by going to knight b4, and then we just very happily take our draw. But the same can be said for d5. It's the same fork, actually. So if we go to knight c2, this is the barrier we will be creating, and the barrier the king will have to maneuver around to go attack our knight. We can see that this barrier is not very effective, because the king can simply go to d2, and now it's attacking our knight, and our king had no time whatsoever to get close to the pawn. Alright, we can see that knight c2 is probably not it. What about knight b3? What barrier does this create? Well, this is the same thing. We draw the squares that the knight defends. We will see that these 3 squares are kind of useless because only these 2 squares prevent the forks. And now we can see that this barrier is much more effective. The king literally has to walk around this barrier to go attack our knight. Now let's see what happens when they do, because that's ultimately their goal, is to attack our knight and to prevent our defense of the a1 square. Before we play out this position, let's first see what the white king's goal is. Our goal is to defend this knight. If we can defend the knight on b3, this is the freest draw ever. It is a very strong fortress, and black has just no way of winning. So black, knowing this, will not go towards f2 and try to walk this way. Black will try to walk upwards so that they can block our king from defending the knight. But in this position, we will see that white king has actually 2 objectives, 2 different ways it can stop the black pawn from promoting. Let us now play out the scenario. Okay, Now the white knight is being attacked and our king is nowhere near close enough to defend it. It really looks like it's lost, but we have another ace up our sleeve if we simply go and block the pawn from promoting with the intention to sacrifice the knight. Why? This is because after the king captures the knight, we get a very, very interesting position where we actually get to force stalemate upon black and draw the game this way instead. To summarize, if the pawn is not a knight or a rook pawn, getting in front of the pawn or laterally defending it is a draw. If the pawn is a knight pawn, only getting in front of it can be a draw. And if it is a rook pawn on the 6th rank, you need to enter this circuit. And if it is on the 7th rank, you need to find which wall is the best and pray you have enough time to walk your king there. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was helpful.